6 years ago, Brian Matthews, a decorated 38-year-old SWAT officer with the Los Angeles Police Department, vanished without a trace during what was supposed to be a routine classified operation. On March 15, 2018, Brian kissed his wife Sarah goodbye at 5:47 a.m., promised his twin daughters Emma and Sophie he'd be home for their soccer game, and drove away in his unmarked black Suburban. He was heading to what his commanding officer called a federal assistance mission in Nevada. Brian Matthews never returned home. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we reopen archived cases with respect and proof. The disappearance didn't just shatter the Matthews family, it sent shockwaves through the tight-knit SWAT community and raised disturbing questions about federal operations that no one seemed willing to answer. Sarah Matthews, a pediatric nurse at Cedars-Sinai, found herself thrust into a nightmare that would consume the next 6 years of her life. Their daughters, just 8 years old when their father vanished, would grow into teenagers, still asking the same haunting question: where is Daddy? The official story was maddeningly vague. Brian had been selected for temporary assignment with a federal task force conducting sensitive security operations in Nevada. His commanding officer, Captain Rodriguez, could only tell the family that Brian's unit had lost contact during the mission and that all available resources were being used to locate him. But as days turned to weeks and weeks to months, it became increasingly clear that the LAPD knew far less than they claimed. What made Brian's disappearance even more chilling was his impeccable record. In 14 years with the LAPD, he had never missed a shift, never failed to follow protocol, never left his team behind. Brian was the officer others called when they needed someone reliable, someone who would bring everyone home safe. His psychological evaluations consistently rated him as exceptionally stable and mission-focused. This wasn't a man who would simply walk away from his life, his family, his duty. The federal agencies involved, FBI, Department of Defense, and unnamed national security entities, erected walls of classification around the case that would prove nearly impenetrable. Every document request was denied. Every Freedom of Information Act filing was returned heavily redacted or marked classified national security. Even Brian's own department seemed powerless against the bureaucratic black hole that had swallowed their officer. Sarah Matthews refused to accept silence as an answer. Armed with nothing but love for her husband and fierce determination, she began a solitary investigation that would reveal disturbing patterns of federal secrecy, questionable military operations, and a cover-up that reached the highest levels of government. Her journey would take her from the corridors of power in Washington, D.C. to the barren deserts of Nevada, where America's most classified secrets are buried beneath miles of sand and layers of lies. The case that began as a missing person report would evolve into something far more sinister, a story of a good man who saw something he shouldn't have, and the lengths certain people would go to ensure he could never tell anyone about it. This is the story of Brian Matthews, a devoted father and decorated officer who disappeared into America's most classified shadows, and the family that refused to let him be forgotten. In the Nevada desert, secrets don't stay buried forever. Sometimes they surface in the most unexpected ways. The first 72 hours after Brian Matthews disappeared were critical, but they were also shrouded in the kind of bureaucratic stonewalling that would define the entire case. Sarah Matthews spent those initial days in a state of suspended animation, torn between hope and growing dread, as official channels provided nothing but vague assurances and classified roadblocks. Captain Rodriguez called a meeting at the LAPD's Metropolitan Division headquarters on March 18th, 3 days after Brian's disappearance. Sarah arrived expecting answers, but found only more questions. Present in the sterile conference room were Rodriguez, FBI agent Jennifer Walsh, and a man in a dark suit who introduced himself simply as Mr. Thompson from the Department of Defense. The conversation that followed would haunt Sarah for years to come. "Mrs. Matthews, your husband was involved in a joint operation of national importance," Agent Walsh began, her voice clinical and detached. "Due to the sensitive nature of the mission, we're limited in what information we can share, even with family members." When Sarah pressed for basic details, where exactly Brian had gone, who he was with, when he was last seen, she was met with the same response. "That information is classified." Mr. Thompson was even more direct. "Your husband knew the risks when he accepted this assignment. These operations sometimes encounter complications. We're doing everything we can within the parameters of national security. The implication was clear. Brian's life was secondary to whatever secrets needed protecting. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in institutional gaslighting. Sarah was told that search efforts were ongoing, but given no details about what those efforts entailed. She was assured that Brian's disappearance was being treated as highest priority, while simultaneously being told that she couldn't speak to investigators, couldn't visit the operation site, and couldn't even know the exact location where her husband had vanished. Emma and Sophie Matthews, meanwhile, were struggling to understand why their father hadn't come home. Their 8-year-old minds couldn't grasp concepts like classified operations or national security. They just knew that Daddy had broken his promise to watch their soccer game, and that Mommy cried when she thought they weren't looking. Sarah found herself having to explain the unexplainable, how a good man could simply vanish, and how the people who were supposed to find him seemed more interested in keeping secrets than finding answers. The Matthews family quickly learned that grief without closure is a special kind of torture. Sarah couldn't mourn her husband because she didn't know if he was dead. She couldn't move on with her life because she didn't know if he was coming back. She existed in a grey area between widowhood and abandonment, a place where hope became both salvation and torment. Brian's SWAT teammates rallied around the family, but they too were frustrated by the wall of silence. These were men who had served alongside Brian in life-or-death situations, who trusted him with their lives and would have followed him anywhere. Now they were powerless to help him, reduced to spectators in a game whose rules they weren't allowed to know. Officer Marcus Johnson, Brian's longtime partner, took it especially hard. Brian would never abandon his team, he told Sarah during one of many unofficial visits to their home. If he's not coming back, it's because something happened to him, or because someone is preventing him from coming back. Either way, this isn't over. Brian wouldn't give up on us, and we won't give up on him. But as months passed with no new information, even the most dedicated supporters began to waver. Life moved on. Other cases demanded attention, and Brian Matthews began to fade from active memory, everywhere except in the hearts of his wife and daughters, where his absence burned brighter with each passing day. Sarah Matthews faced a choice that no spouse should ever have to make: accept the official silence and try to rebuild her shattered life, or dedicate herself to finding answers that powerful people clearly didn't want found. For Sarah, it wasn't really a choice at all. Brian had spent his career protecting others. Now it was her turn to protect him, even if it meant battling her own government. The investigation that would consume the next 6 years of her life began with a simple realization. If the government wouldn't tell her what happened to her husband, she would find out for herself. Sarah Matthews was about to discover that in America, some truths are considered too dangerous for families to know, but she was also about to prove that a mother's love can be more persistent than any government's secrets. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one you can see, it's the one hiding behind the flag. By the summer of 2018, Sarah Matthews had exhausted every official channel in her search for answers about Brian's disappearance. Federal agencies had stonewalled her, the LAPD claimed they were powerless against classification protocols, and even sympathetic congressmen told her that national security trumped her right to know what happened to her husband. Left with no alternative, Sarah decided to conduct her own investigation, a decision that would lead her into America's most classified wilderness. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Brian's credit card records, obtained through their joint account, showed his last transaction at a gas station in Rachel, Nevada, on March 15th at 11:43 p.m., nearly 18 hours after he'd left home for what was supposed to be a routine assignment. Rachel, population 98, sits on the edge of the Nevada Test and Training Range, just 26 miles from the infamous Area 51. Sarah stared at the receipt printout, her hands shaking as she realized her husband had been much farther from home and much deeper in classified territory than anyone had told her. Armed with this crucial piece of information, Sarah made the 6-hour drive from Los Angeles to Rachel in her Honda Civic, bringing along her sister Michelle for moral support and her own amateur investigation kit, a digital camera, notebook, and copies of Brian's photos. The journey through the Mojave Desert felt like descending into another world, a harsh landscape where the government owned everything and civilians were barely tolerated. Rachel, Nevada, exists primarily to serve the curiosity seekers and conspiracy theorists drawn to Area 51's mystique, but Sarah quickly discovered it was also home to people who had seen things they weren't supposed to see. The Little Alien, a combination restaurant, bar and UFO-themed gift shop, became her unofficial headquarters during multiple trips to the area over the following months. It was there she met Tom Crawford, a retired Air Force security specialist who had worked at Nellis Air Force Base for 27 years. Tom was initially skeptical when Sarah approached him with Brian's photo, but his expression changed when she mentioned the date and location of the gas station transaction. March 15th, Tom said slowly, setting down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. There was something that night. I wasn't on duty, but I heard the chatter on the radio frequencies. Multiple helicopters, ground units, some kind of incident at the Groom Lake facility. Communications went dark around midnight, then everything was locked down for 3 days. Tom's revelation was the first confirmation Sarah had received that something significant had indeed happened the night Brian disappeared. But it also raised more disturbing questions. If there had been an incident requiring multiple helicopters and ground units, what had Brian walked into? And why had his own department been told he was simply on routine assignment? Sarah spent countless weekends making the drive to Rachel, gradually building relationships with the locals who lived in the shadow of America's most secret base. She spoke with former military personnel, current base employees who couldn't say much but whose expressions said everything, and the handful of civilians who had witnessed unusual activity on the night of March 15th. Patricia Vega, who ran a small motel on the outskirts of Rachel, remembered that night clearly. Around 2 a.m., the whole sky lit up like the 4th of July, she told Sarah. Helicopters everywhere, sirens, then nothing. Complete radio silence for days after. I've lived out here for 15 years, seen plenty of military exercises, but this was different. This felt like an emergency. Each piece of information Sarah gathered painted a picture of a significant operation that had gone wrong, but the official response remained the same. Classified, no comment, national security. Even sympathetic sources could only speak in generalities, terrified of the consequences of revealing classified information. The psychological toll on Sarah was immense. Each trip to Nevada meant time away from Emma and Sophie, who were already struggling with their father's absence. Sarah found herself torn between her duties as a mother and her determination to find Brian. The girls needed stability and normalcy, but how could she provide that when their father's fate remained a mystery? During one particularly difficult evening, after returning from another fruitless trip to Rachel, 8-year-old Emma asked her mother a question that would haunt Sarah for years. "Mommy, did Daddy die because he was trying to protect people?" Sarah realized she couldn't answer that question because she still didn't know what Brian had been protecting people from, or if he had become the one who needed protection. The investigation was also taking a financial toll. Sarah's nursing salary barely covered the family's expenses without Brian's SWAT pay, and the constant trips to Nevada, along with private investigator fees and legal consultations, were draining their savings. Friends and family began suggesting that maybe it was time to move on, to accept that Brian was gone and focus on rebuilding her life with the twins. But Sarah Matthews had inherited her husband's stubbornness and his sense of justice. Every official denial, every classified stamp, every bureaucratic roadblock only strengthened her resolve. Brian Matthews had devoted his life to seeking truth and protecting others. She would do no less for him. As 2018 turned to 2019, Sarah's investigation had established several crucial facts. Brian had traveled far from his supposed assignment location, there had been a significant military incident the night he disappeared, and powerful people were working very hard to ensure these facts remained hidden. What she hadn't found was her husband, or any concrete proof of what had happened to him. In the desert, mirages can look like truth, but sometimes the most impossible things are the most real. 3 years into her investigation, Sarah Matthews had hit what seemed like an insurmountable wall. Every lead in Nevada had been explored, every official channel exhausted, and every Freedom of Information request denied or returned with pages of black redaction marks. The family's savings were nearly depleted, and even her most supportive friends were gently suggesting it might be time to accept that Brian was gone forever. But on a cold February morning in 2021, everything changed with a single phone call. The voice on the other end was electronically distorted, making it impossible to determine if the caller was male or female, young or old. "Mrs. Matthews, I knew your husband. What happened to him wasn't an accident, and it wasn't part of any official mission. If you want the truth, you need to stop looking in the desert and start looking at the people who sent him there." Before Sarah could respond, the caller continued, "Your husband discovered something he wasn't supposed to see. There are people who will kill to keep it secret, and there are people who have already died because of it. Brian Matthews was a good man who got caught in something much bigger than a routine federal assignment. The question is, how far are you willing to go to learn the truth?" The call lasted less than 2 minutes, but it shattered Sarah's understanding of her husband's disappearance. This wasn't about a military operation gone wrong or a classified accident. This was about something that powerful people were willing to commit murder to conceal. The caller had promised to contact her again with more specific information, but warned that pursuing the truth would put both her and her daughters in danger. Sarah spent sleepless nights wrestling with an impossible decision. Part of her wanted to abandon the investigation, to prioritize her daughter's safety and try to build a normal life without Brian. But the larger part, the part that had fallen in love with a man who devoted his life to protecting others, couldn't accept that Brian's killers might go unpunished simply because their crimes were too dangerous to investigate. 2 weeks later, the mysterious caller contacted her again, this time with more specific information. "Your husband was part of a unit that was supposed to secure a facility that had been compromised. Someone had broken into areas containing experimental technology that officially doesn't exist. Brian's team was sent to contain the situation, but when they arrived, they discovered that the breach wasn't from outside. Someone on the inside had been selling access to foreign agents. The implications were staggering. If the caller was telling the truth, Brian hadn't disappeared during a routine federal operation. He had stumbled into a spy ring operating within America's most classified military installations. The anonymous source claimed that Brian had gathered evidence of the espionage ring, but was killed before he could report it to his superiors. "Your husband was an honest cop in a dirty game," the voice continued. "He tried to do the right thing, and they killed him for it. But Brian was smart. He hid copies of the evidence he found. If you can find what he hid, you can expose the people who killed him. But understand this, these people have killed federal agents, military personnel, and civilians to protect their operation. They won't hesitate to kill you and your children." Sarah's hands shook as she recorded every word of the conversation. The caller provided specific details that could be verified. Dates of suspicious activities at the Nevada facility, names of personnel who had died in accidents after asking uncomfortable questions, and most crucially, a location where Brian might have hidden evidence before his final mission. According to the source, Brian had rented a storage unit in Barstow, California, under a false name, the same alias he had used during undercover operations with the LAPD. The caller provided the facility name, unit number, and even the combination Brian had likely used, based on a pattern he employed in previous cases. Sarah drove to Barstow the next weekend, her heart pounding as she approached the Desert View storage facility on the outskirts of town. Unit 47B was exactly where the caller had said it would be, and the combination, based on the twins' birth date reversed, opened the lock on her first attempt. Inside the small storage unit, Sarah found a world that turned her understanding of her husband's disappearance upside down. Brian had indeed been preparing for something dangerous. The unit contained 3 laptops, dozens of encrypted flash drives, copies of classified documents, and, most chillingly, a video recording addressed to Sarah herself. In the video, recorded just days before his disappearance, Brian looked directly into the camera, with the serious expression Sarah knew meant he was facing something life-threatening. "Sarah, if you're watching this, it means something has happened to me. I've discovered something at the Nevada facility that goes to the highest levels of our government. People I trusted, people who took oaths to protect this country, are selling our most advanced military technology to foreign powers." Brian's recorded message continued, "I've gathered evidence of a spy ring that includes federal agents, military officers, and defense contractors. They've been using the Area 51 facility as their base of operations, knowing that the classification levels would protect them from investigation. I've tried to report this through official channels, but I believe the corruption goes too high for normal procedures to work." The final part of Brian's message was a direct plea to his wife. "If something happens to me, don't trust the official story. These people will tell you I died in the line of duty, or that I went missing during a classified operation. The truth is that I'm going to try to gather the final evidence needed to expose them, and they know it. Sarah, I love you and the girls more than life itself. If I don't come home, it's because I died trying to protect the country we love from enemies within." Sarah sat in the storage unit for hours, surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of American intelligence and defense establishments. Her husband hadn't simply disappeared. He had been murdered by traitors who wore the same uniform he had sworn to honor. The question now was whether she had the courage to finish what Brian had started, knowing that the same people who had killed her husband wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatened their operation. The truth had finally found her, but some truths come with a price that must be paid in blood. The discovery of Brian's hidden storage unit marked a turning point in Sarah Matthews' investigation, but it also thrust her into a world of danger she was unprepared to navigate. The evidence Brian had collected painted a picture of corruption and treason that reached into the highest levels of the American defense establishment. But having evidence and being able to act on it safely were two entirely different challenges. Sarah spent weeks carefully examining the contents of the storage unit, bringing the encrypted drives and laptops to Marcus Johnson, Brian's former SWAT partner, who had maintained his own unofficial investigation into the disappearance. Marcus had retired from the LAPD in 2020, frustrated by the department's inability to get answers about his missing partner, and now worked as a private investigator. His experience with digital forensics and his loyalty to Brian made him the only person Sarah felt she could trust with the explosive evidence. The encrypted files, when finally decoded using passwords based on Brian's personal history, revealed a systematic pattern of espionage dating back to 2015. The spy ring had been selling access to experimental aircraft technology, advanced weaponry designs, and satellite intelligence to a network of foreign buyers. The operation was sophisticated, using the Area 51 facility's extreme classification levels as cover for meetings between American traitors and foreign agents. Brian's final investigation had focused on Dr. Amanda Chen, a civilian contractor working on experimental aircraft propulsion systems, and Colonel Robert Hayes, a career Air Force officer who supervised security for the most sensitive areas of the Nevada facility. According to Brian's notes, Dr. Chen had been providing technical specifications to Chinese intelligence agents, while Colonel Hayes ensured that security protocols were modified to allow unauthorized access during carefully orchestrated windows. The evidence included photographs of clandestine meetings, copies of financial records showing suspicious payments to offshore accounts, and most damning of all, recordings of conversations in which Chen and Hayes discussed the timing of Brian's final mission. The recordings made it clear that they knew Brian was investigating them and that his March 15th assignment had been designed to eliminate him as a threat. "Matthews is getting too close," Colonel Hayes could be heard saying in a recording from March 12th. "We can't risk him gathering more evidence. The Nevada operation needs to be sanitized, and that includes loose ends." Dr. Chen's response was equally chilling. "The foreign contractors are already in place. Make sure the SWAT officer's communication equipment malfunctions during the operation. Desert accidents are unfortunately common in that area." Marcus Johnson listened to the recordings with the grim expression of a man watching his worst fears confirmed. "They didn't just kill Brian," he told Sarah. "They planned it. They used his own sense of duty against him, sending him on a mission designed to eliminate him. This isn't just murder. It's the worst kind of betrayal imaginable." But having evidence of Brian's murder was only the beginning of Sarah's problems. The spy ring that had killed her husband was still operational, still had access to classified facilities, and still had the power to eliminate threats to their operation. Worse, some of the evidence suggested that the corruption reached into federal law enforcement agencies, making it unclear who could be trusted with the information. Sarah and Marcus spent months developing a strategy for safely exposing the evidence. They couldn't simply turn it over to the FBI, since Brian's notes indicated that at least one federal agent was part of the conspiracy. They couldn't trust the military justice system, since Colonel Hayes held significant influence within Air Force security structures. And they couldn't go to the media without risking their own lives, since several journalists who had investigated Area 51-related stories had died in suspicious circumstances. The breakthrough came when Marcus identified Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos, an Air Force Office of Special Investigations officer who had been conducting her own investigation into security breaches at Nevada facilities. Santos had a reputation for integrity and had been asking uncomfortable questions about the same time period when Brian disappeared. Most importantly, she had been stationed in Germany during the events Brian had documented, making it unlikely she was part of the conspiracy. The meeting with Lieutenant Colonel Santos took place in a public park in Colorado Springs, far from any military installation. Sarah brought copies of the most crucial evidence, while Marcus provided security and verified Santos's identity through his law enforcement contacts. Santos's reaction to the evidence confirmed both its authenticity and its explosive potential. Mrs. Matthews, what your husband discovered represents one of the most serious security breaches in modern American military history, Santos said, after reviewing the documents. This conspiracy has potentially compromised decades of research and development, putting American military superiority at risk. But you need to understand that exposing this will put you and your family in extreme danger. These people have killed to protect their operation, and they won't stop now. Santos agreed to coordinate with trusted colleagues to begin a formal investigation, but warned that the process would take time and that Sarah needed to take immediate steps to protect herself and her daughters. The evidence would need to be verified through multiple independent sources. The surviving members of the spy ring would need to be identified and monitored, and a careful strategy would need to be developed to prevent the destruction of additional evidence. As Sarah drove home from Colorado Springs, she realized that her 6-year search for answers about Brian's disappearance was entering its most dangerous phase. She finally knew the truth about what had happened to her husband, but that knowledge came with the sobering realization that the same people who had killed Brian were still out there, still operational, and now aware that their crimes might be exposed. Emma and Sophie, now 14 years old, had grown up without their father and were about to learn that he hadn't simply died in the line of duty, he had been murdered by the very system he had sworn to serve. Sarah faced the heartbreaking task of explaining to her daughters that their father's killers were still free, but that justice might finally be possible if they were willing to risk everything to achieve it. If this case has already gripped you, hit the like button. It helps Brian's story reach more people. Sometimes the most patriotic act is exposing the traitors who hide behind the flag. On November 3, 2024, exactly 6 years and 7 months after Brian Matthews disappeared, Sarah's phone rang at 11:47 p.m. She had been working late at Cedars-Sinai, pulling a double shift to help cover the family's ongoing legal expenses, when an unknown number appeared on her screen. Sarah almost didn't answer. She had learned to be cautious about unexpected calls, especially after her investigation into Brian's death had attracted unwanted attention from people who preferred their crimes to remain hidden. But something about the timing felt significant. Sarah answered on the 4th ring, and the voice that greeted her would finally provide the closure she had sought for over 6 years. Mrs. Matthews, this is Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos, Air Force Office of Special Investigations. I'm calling with news about your husband's case. We have arrests, and we have justice. The words hit Sarah like a physical force. After years of stonewalling, classification stamps, and bureaucratic delays, the simple phrase, "we have arrests," seemed almost impossible to believe. Santos continued. Working with the FBI's Counterintelligence Division and the Department of Justice, we have successfully concluded Operation Desert Shield, the investigation into the espionage ring that murdered your husband. 7 individuals have been arrested on charges ranging from treason to murder conspiracy. Dr. Amanda Chen had been arrested at her home in McLean, Virginia, as she prepared to board a flight to Beijing. Colonel Robert Hayes was taken into custody at Nellis Air Force Base, where he had continued to serve in his security role even while under investigation. Most satisfying to Sarah, the arrests included Agent Jennifer Walsh, the FBI agent who had stonewalled the family's search for answers and who had been secretly protecting the spy ring from federal investigation. Your husband's evidence was crucial to building the case, Santos explained. The storage unit you discovered contained the final pieces we needed to prove the conspiracy and identify all the participants. Brian Matthews died protecting his country from enemies within, and his sacrifice has prevented classified technology worth billions of dollars from reaching hostile foreign powers. But the phone call brought more than just news of arrests. Santos revealed that Brian's body had been recovered from a remote area of the Nevada test range, where it had been buried after his murder on March 16, 2018. The discovery had been made possible by testimony from one of the conspiracy members who agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. "Mrs. Matthews, I know this has been an incredibly difficult journey for you and your daughters," Santos continued, "but I want you to know that your husband's courage and integrity have been vindicated. Brian Matthews died as he lived, serving his country and protecting others, even when it cost him everything. The formal details would take weeks to be fully revealed, but Santos provided Sarah with the basic outline of what had happened to Brian. On March 15, 2018, Brian had been sent to investigate what his supervisors claimed was a security breach at the Nevada facility. In reality, he was being lured into a trap by Colonel Hayes, who knew that Brian had gathered evidence of the espionage ring. Brian had been murdered shortly after midnight on March 16th, killed by 2 foreign operatives who were in the country to receive stolen technology from Dr. Chen and Colonel Hayes. His body had been buried in the desert, and his death had been covered up using the facility's extreme classification protocols. For 6 years, the truth had been buried along with Brian's remains, protected by the same secrecy that was supposed to safeguard America's most important military secrets. Sarah hung up the phone and sat in her car in the hospital parking lot, overwhelmed by emotions she had been holding back for over 6 years. Relief, vindication, grief, and exhaustion washed over her in waves. Brian was finally coming home. His killers were finally facing justice, and the truth she had fought so hard to uncover was finally being acknowledged by the same government that had tried to keep it hidden. The drive home to tell Emma and Sophie that their father's murderers had been arrested was the longest and most emotionally charged journey of Sarah's life. The twins, now 15 years old, had grown up knowing their mother was fighting for answers about their father's death, but they had never been told the full scope of what Sarah had discovered. Tonight, they would learn that their father had died as a hero, killed by traitors who had sold America's secrets to foreign enemies. Emma and Sophie took the news with the maturity that comes from growing up too fast, but also with the satisfaction of finally understanding why their father had never come home. "Daddy always said that good cops never give up," Sophie said through her tears. "And you never gave up on him, Mom. You brought him home." The formal announcement of the arrests would make national headlines within days, vindicating Sarah's 6-year investigation and exposing one of the most serious spy rings in modern American history. But for Sarah Matthews, the most important victory was simpler and more personal. Brian Matthews would finally receive the hero's burial he deserved, and his daughters would grow up knowing that their father had died protecting the country he loved. The conspiracy that had seemed too powerful to challenge, too classified to investigate, and too dangerous to expose, had finally been brought down by the persistence of a wife who refused to accept that some truths were too dangerous to know. Sarah Matthews had proven that love could be stronger than classification stamps, that determination could overcome bureaucratic stonewalling, and that justice, however delayed, could still be achieved. As Sarah tucked her daughters into bed that night, she whispered a promise she had been making for over 6 years. "Daddy's coming home now. His fight is over, and we won." In the end, the most powerful weapon against corruption is someone who refuses to stop believing in justice. The federal courthouse in Las Vegas became the stage for one of the most significant espionage trials in American history when the United States vs. Chen, Hayes, Walsh, and others began on March 15, 2025, exactly 7 years after Brian Matthews disappeared. Sarah Matthews sat in the front row of the public gallery, flanked by Emma and Sophie, now 16 years old, as prosecutors prepared to present evidence that would finally give voice to her husband's sacrifice. The case had attracted international attention, not just because of the scale of the espionage ring, but because it represented a rare instance where a family's persistent investigation had succeeded in exposing corruption that the government itself had failed to detect. Media outlets from around the world descended on Las Vegas to cover what legal experts were calling the trial that redefined national security accountability. Lead prosecutor assistant U.S. Attorney Catherine Morrison opened the government's case with a statement that sent chills through the packed courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about the ultimate betrayal. American citizens entrusted with our nation's most sacred secrets, who sold those secrets to foreign enemies, and who murdered a law enforcement officer to cover their crimes. Dr. Amanda Chen, dressed in an orange prison jumpsuit, showed no emotion, as Morrison detailed how she had systematically photographed classified documents and passed them to Chinese intelligence operatives over a period of 4 years. The prosecution presented evidence showing that Chen had received over $2.3 million in payments to offshore accounts in exchange for technical specifications that had advanced China's military aircraft capabilities by an estimated decade. Colonel Robert Hayes, his military decorations stripped and his uniform replaced with civilian clothes, stared straight ahead as prosecutors detailed his role in facilitating unauthorized access to the most secure areas of the Nevada facility. Hayes had used his security clearance to disable alarm systems, alter guard schedules, and ensure that foreign operatives could access classified areas without detection. But it was the testimony about Brian Matthews' murder that brought Sarah to tears and sparked audible gasps from the gallery. FBI agent Jennifer Walsh, who had agreed to testify against her co-conspirators in exchange for a life sentence instead of the death penalty, provided chilling details about the plot to eliminate Brian as a threat to the operation. Colonel Hayes called me on March 14th and told me that Officer Matthews had gathered enough evidence to expose the entire operation, Walsh testified, her voice barely above a whisper. He said the only way to protect ourselves was to make sure Matthews never made it back from his assignment. I knew what he meant, and I helped make it happen. Walsh's testimony revealed that Brian's final mission had been entirely fabricated. There had been no security breach requiring SWAT assistance, no federal task force requesting LAPD support, and no legitimate reason for Brian to be in Nevada. The entire operation had been designed to lure Brian to a remote location where foreign operatives could kill him without witnesses. The most devastating moment of the trial came when prosecutors played Brian's final radio transmission, recovered from equipment found at the murder site. In the recording, Brian could be heard realizing that he had been betrayed. "Control, this is Matthews. The supposed breach site is empty. I'm seeing no federal units, no evidence of the reported intrusion. Something's wrong here. I think—" The transmission ended abruptly with sounds of gunfire and Brian's voice calling out in pain. Emma and Sophie held their mother's hands as the recording played, finally understanding the full horror of what their father had experienced in his final moments. But they also heard something else in Brian's voice. Even facing death, he had remained professional, trying to report what he was discovering, determined to protect others even as his own life was ending. Dr. Chen's defense attorney attempted to portray her as a victim of foreign coercion, claiming that Chinese operatives had threatened her family to force her cooperation. But the prosecution countered with evidence of Chen's lavish lifestyle, funded by espionage payments, including a $400,000 sports car and a vacation home in the Bahamas purchased with money from selling American military secrets. Colonel Hayes's defense was even less credible. His attorneys claimed he had been conducting his own investigation into security vulnerabilities and that his actions had been misunderstood. However, recordings of his conversations with foreign agents made it clear that Hayes had been a willing and enthusiastic participant in the espionage ring. The trial's most shocking revelation came from testimony by Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a former colleague of Chen's who had worked on the same classified projects. Warren revealed that the espionage ring had been planning to steal specifications for an experimental hypersonic weapons system that could have fundamentally shifted global military balance. Brian's investigation had interrupted this plan just days before the final transfer was scheduled to occur. Officer Matthews didn't just die investigating a spy ring, Warren testified. He died preventing technology that could have been used against American forces from reaching our enemies. His investigation saved countless American lives by stopping the transfer of weapons that could have made our military defenses obsolete. As the trial progressed through 3 weeks of testimony, a clear picture emerged of Brian Matthews as a hero who had died protecting national security from enemies within. The evidence he had gathered, the risks he had taken, and ultimately the sacrifice he had made had prevented one of the most damaging intelligence losses in American history. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts against all defendants. Dr. Chen and Colonel Hayes were each sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Agent Walsh, who had cooperated with prosecutors, received life with the possibility of parole after 30 years. 4 other conspirators received sentences ranging from 25 years to life. As the sentences were read, Sarah Matthews felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had been carrying for 7 years. Justice had not just been served, it had been delivered with the full force of American law, validating every sleepless night, every dangerous investigation, every moment she had refused to give up on finding the truth about her husband's death. When the gavel falls on justice, it echoes through eternity for those who never stopped believing in truth. On a clear morning in April 2025, Brian Matthews finally came home. The hero's funeral that should have happened 7 years earlier was held at the Cathedral of Our Lady of the Angels in downtown Los Angeles, with full honors and the recognition that had been denied by years of classification and cover-up. Sarah Matthews, dressed in black and flanked by Emma and Sophie, watched as her husband received the send-off worthy of a man who had died protecting his country. The funeral procession stretched for miles through the streets of Los Angeles, led by every available SWAT vehicle from the LAPD and followed by law enforcement officers from across the country who had come to honor one of their own. American flags lined the route, held by civilians who had followed Brian's story and understood that he represented the best of what it meant to serve others. Captain Rodriguez, now retired but present in full-dress uniform, delivered the eulogy that he should have been able to give 7 years earlier. "Brian Matthews embodied everything we hope for in a law enforcement officer," he said, his voice carrying across the packed cathedral. "He was brave without being reckless, determined without being rigid, and loyal to his principles even when that loyalty cost him his life. Brian died as he lived, protecting others and serving the truth." The ceremony included honors that reflected both Brian's law enforcement career and his ultimate sacrifice for national security. Representatives from the FBI, the Department of Defense, and the Air Force Office of Special Investigations participated in the service, acknowledging that Brian's death had prevented a catastrophic intelligence loss that could have compromised American security for decades. Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos, who had coordinated the investigation that brought Brian's killers to justice, presented Sarah with the Defense Department's Civilian Award for Exceptional Service, an honor recognizing Brian's contribution to national security. "Your husband's courage and integrity saved American lives," Santos told Sarah. "His investigation exposed enemies within our own ranks and prevented technology that could have been used against our forces from reaching hostile powers." But the most meaningful moment of the service came when Marcus Johnson, Brian's former SWAT partner, spoke about the man behind the badge. "Brian wasn't just a great cop," Johnson said. "He was a great father who taught his daughters by example what it means to stand up for what's right. He was a great husband who showed his wife every day what true partnership looks like. And he was a great friend who never let his team down, even when following orders meant walking into a trap." Emma and Sophie had prepared their own tribute to their father, reading a letter they had written together. "Dad, we were 8 years old when you left, and we're 16 now. We grew up without you, but we never grew up without your example. Mom taught us that you died because you wouldn't let bad people hurt our country. We're proud to be your daughters, and we promise to live our lives with the same courage and integrity you showed us." The burial service at Forest Lawn Memorial Park was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by Brian's story. Fellow officers who had served with him, neighbors who remembered his kindness, and complete strangers who had been inspired by his sacrifice, all came to pay their respects to a man who had embodied the highest ideals of service and sacrifice. As Brian's casket was lowered into the ground, Sarah placed a hand on each of her daughter's shoulders and whispered the words she had been waiting 7 years to say. "Your father is finally at peace. His fight is over, and he won." The weeks following the funeral brought a different kind of healing for the Matthews family. The classified stamp that had hidden Brian's sacrifice was finally removed, allowing his story to be told in full. The LAPD formally recognized Brian's final investigation as one of the most significant counterintelligence operations in the department's history, and his name was added to the memorial wall, honoring officers who died in the line of duty. Sarah returned to her work as a pediatric nurse, but also began speaking about her experience to law enforcement families and government accountability groups. Her story became a powerful example of how persistent advocacy could overcome institutional stonewalling, and how the love of a family could be stronger than the machinery of government secrecy. Emma and Sophie, meanwhile, began their junior year of high school with a new understanding of their father's legacy and their mother's strength. They had grown up in the shadow of tragedy, but they had also learned lessons about courage, persistence, and the importance of never giving up on truth that would guide them for the rest of their lives. The house in Woodland Hills, that had been filled with uncertainty and grief for 7 years, began to feel like a home again. Photos of Brian returned to their places on walls and tables, no longer painful reminders of loss, but celebrations of a life lived with purpose and honor. The family that had been shattered by his disappearance was finally able to begin healing from his death. In quiet moments, Sarah would sometimes wonder what their lives would have been like if Brian had never stumbled onto the espionage ring, if he had never felt compelled to investigate the corruption he discovered, if he had chosen personal safety over national security. But she always reached the same conclusion. Brian Matthews would never have been able to live with himself if he had allowed enemies of America to continue operating under his watch. He had died exactly as he had lived, protecting others, serving truth and refusing to compromise his principles regardless of the cost. The investigation that had consumed 7 years of Sarah's life was finally over, but the lessons it had taught about love, persistence, and the power of one person to make a difference would last forever. Heroes never truly die. They live on in the courage they inspire in others. What we learn in darkness, we carry into light. 2 years after Brian Matthews was finally laid to rest, his legacy continues to ripple through American law enforcement and intelligence communities in ways that honor both his sacrifice and his family's relentless pursuit of truth. The case that began with a missing person report and evolved into one of the most significant counter-espionage operations in modern history has fundamentally changed how the government handles classified investigations involving law enforcement personnel. The Brian Matthews Act, signed into law in December 2025, requires that families of law enforcement officers who disappear or die during classified operations receive regular briefings about the status of investigations, regardless of classification levels. The law also establishes independent oversight mechanisms to prevent the kind of cover-up that allowed Brian's killers to operate freely for 7 years. Sarah Matthews, now recognized as one of the most effective civilian investigators in American history, has become a powerful advocate for government transparency and family rights. Her testimony before Congress about the obstacles she faced while searching for answers about Brian's death led to significant reforms in how federal agencies interact with families of missing or deceased personnel. "My husband died serving his country, but I nearly died trying to find out how and why," Sarah told the Senate Judiciary Committee during hearings on the legislation that would bear Brian's name. No family should have to fight their own government for 7 years to learn the truth about their loved one's sacrifice. Classification cannot be used as a tool to avoid accountability or to cover up crimes committed by those entrusted with our nation's security. Emma and Sophie Matthews, now 18 years old and preparing for college, have grown into young women shaped by both tragedy and triumph. Emma plans to study criminal justice, inspired by her father's example and her mother's investigation. Sophie has chosen to pursue journalism, determined to ensure that other families won't have to fight alone for answers about government misconduct. "We learned that the truth doesn't always come from official sources," Sophie explained during a recent interview. "Sometimes it comes from people who refuse to accept that some questions can't be answered. Our mom taught us that persistence can overcome almost any obstacle, and that love for family can be stronger than fear of powerful institutions." The espionage ring that killed Brian Matthews had been operating for nearly 5 years before his investigation exposed it, during which time they had transferred military technology worth an estimated $50 billion to foreign powers. Counterintelligence experts believe that the weapons systems and aircraft designs stolen by the ring advanced hostile nations' military capabilities by at least a decade, making Brian's sacrifice even more significant in terms of national security. Dr. Amanda Chen died in federal prison in 2026, reportedly from complications related to a heart condition. Colonel Robert Hayes remains incarcerated at the federal Supermax facility in Colorado, where he is serving his life sentence in solitary confinement. Former FBI agent Jennifer Walsh, whose cooperation had been crucial to securing convictions against her co-conspirators, was denied parole in 2027 and remains imprisoned with no possibility of release before 2055. The Nevada facility where Brian was murdered has been reorganized with new security protocols designed to prevent the kind of insider threats that made the espionage ring possible. Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos, who coordinated the investigation that brought Brian's killers to justice, was promoted to full colonel and now heads the Air Force's counterintelligence operations, using lessons learned from the Matthews case to identify and prevent similar security breaches. Marcus Johnson, Brian's former SWAT partner, who helped Sarah navigate the dangerous world of federal investigations, has established the Matthews Foundation, a non-profit organization that provides legal and investigative support to families of law enforcement officers who have disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances. The foundation has already assisted dozens of families in obtaining answers that official channels had failed to provide. The storage unit in Barstow, where Brian had hidden his evidence, has been preserved as part of the federal investigation records, but Sarah has created a replica display at the Los Angeles Police Museum to honor her husband's investigative work and to educate visitors about the importance of integrity in law enforcement. The exhibit includes Brian's final video message to his family, serving as a powerful reminder of the personal cost of public service. On the 10th anniversary of Brian's disappearance, Sarah and the twins returned to Rachel, Nevada, not as desperate investigators searching for answers, but as a family finally at peace with the truth. They visited the memorial marker that had been erected near the site where Brian's body was recovered, a simple granite stone bearing his name, dates of service, and the inscription, "He died protecting the country he loved from enemies within." As they stood in the desert where their long journey had begun, Sarah reflected on the lessons learned through 7 years of investigation, legal battles, and ultimately justice. "Brian always said that good cops never give up," she told Emma and Sophie. "We proved that good families don't give up either. We brought him home, we exposed his killers, and we made sure his sacrifice wasn't forgotten." The case of Brian Matthews serves as a powerful reminder that even in an age of government secrecy and institutional power, individual persistence and family love can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. It demonstrates that truth, however buried, will eventually surface when good people refuse to accept that some questions can't be answered. Today, the Matthews family has rebuilt their lives around the memory of a husband and father who died as he lived, serving others and protecting the innocent. Sarah continues her work as a nurse and advocate, Emma is studying criminal justice at UCLA, and Sophie is pursuing journalism at USC. They carry Brian's legacy forward not through grief, but through the knowledge that his sacrifice made America safer, and that their fight for truth has made the system more accountable. The hero who disappeared into the desert darkness has finally come home to the light, and his story continues to inspire others who refuse to let injustice hide behind classification stamps and bureaucratic stonewalling. Brian Matthews' final mission, protecting America from enemies within, was completed not just by his own courage, but by the family that never stopped believing in him. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases throughout America. Thank you for following Brian Matthews' story. See you in the next video. In the end, love proves to be the most powerful weapon against those who would bury truth in darkness. This concludes The Vanishing Agent, a classified disappearance, a 9-chapter true crime documentary series exploring how one family's refusal to accept official silence exposed one of the most significant espionage rings in American history and brought justice to a hero who died protecting his country from enemies within.